Formal slave codes in each state regulated the treatment of slaves to deter runaways or rebellions. Slaves could not leave their owner's land or household without permission, or stay out after dark without an identification pass. Some codes made it a crime for slaves to learn to read and write, for fear that they might pass notes to plan a revolt. Frederick Douglass said that slaveholders assumed that allowing slaves to learn to read and write, quote, would spoil the best nigger in the world, end quote. Slaves in most states could not testify in court. They could not legally marry, own firearms, or hit a white man, even in self-defense. They could also be abused, tortured, and whipped. Despite such restrictions and brutalities, however, the enslaved managed to create their own communities and cultures, forging bonds of care, solidarity, recreation, and religion. African Americans who were not enslaved were called free persons of color. They occupied an uncertain and often vulnerable social status between bondage and freedom. Many lived in constant fear of being kidnapped into slavery. For example, Solomon Northup, a freeborn African American from New York with a wife and 3 children, was kidnapped in 1845 by slave traders, taken to Washington, D.C., and then to New Orleans, and eventually sold to what he referred to as a repulsive and coarse Louisiana planter. More than a decade later, Northup was able to regain his freedom. To be sure, free blacks had more rights than slaves. They could enter into contracts, marry, own property, including slaves of their own, and pass on their property to their children. They were not viewed or treated as equal to whites, however. In most states, they were treated as if they were enslaved. They could not vote, own weapons, attend white church services, or testify against whites in court. In South Carolina, free people of color had to pay an annual tax and were not allowed to leave the state. In 1823, they were required to have a white guardian and an identity card. Some slaves were able to purchase their freedom, and others were freed by their owners. By 1860, approximately 250,000 free blacks lived in the slave states, most of them in coastal cities like Boston, Charleston, and New Orleans. Many were skilled workers. Some were tailors, shoemakers, or carpenters. Others were painters, bricklayers, butchers, blacksmiths, or barbers. Still others worked on the docks or on steamships. Free black women usually worked as laundresses or house servants. The lives of slaves depended in part on the personality of their owner, in part on whether they cultivated rice, sugar, tobacco, or cotton, and in part on whether they were on farms or in cities. Although many slaves were artisans or craftsmen, the vast majority were field hands who were often organized to work gangs supervised by a black driver or white overseer. Some slaves were hired out to other planters or to merchants, churches, or businesses. Others worked on Sundays or holidays to earn cash of their own. Plantation slaves were usually housed in 1- or 2-room wooden shacks with dirt floors. The wealthiest planters built slave cabins out of brick. Beds were a luxury, even though they were little more than boards covered with straw. Most slaves slept on the cold, damp floor with only a cheap blanket for warmth. They received a set of inexpensive linen or cotton clothes twice a year, but shoes were generally provided only in winter. About half of slave babies died in their first year, a rate more than twice that of white infants. The weekly or monthly food allotment was cheap and monotonous. Cornmeal and pork, often served in bowls placed on the ground as if the slaves were livestock. Field hands worked from sunup to sundown 6 days a week. At times they worked at night as well, ginning cotton, milling sugarcane, grinding corn, or doing other indoor tasks. Women, remembered a slave, had to work all day in the fields and then come home and do the housework at night, end quote. Sundays were precious days off. Slaves used the Sabbath to hunt, fish, dance, tell stories, and tend their own small gardens. Although some owners and slaves developed close and even affectionate relationships, slavery on the whole was a system rooted in brutality. The difference between a good owner and a bad one, according to one slave, was the difference between one, quote, who did not whip you too much and one who whipped you till he bloodied you and blistered you. At times, whites turned the punishment of slaves into grisly spectacles to strike fear into anyone considering rebellion or escape. Slaves in cities such as Richmond, Memphis, Atlanta, and New Orleans had a much different experience than those on isolated farms and plantations. A city slave is almost a freeman, claimed a Maryland slave. Slaves in urban households tended to be better fed and clothed and had more privilege. They interacted not only with their white owners, but with the extended interracial community, shopkeepers and police, neighbors and strangers. Some were hired out to others and allowed to keep a portion of their wages. Although enslaved men and women often performed similar chores, especially on farms, they did not experience slavery in the same way. Once slaveholders realized how profitable a fertile female slave could be by giving birth to babies that could later be sold, they encouraged women to have as many children as possible. Sometimes, a woman would be locked in a cabin with a male slave whose task was to impregnate her. Pregnant slaves were given less work and more food. Some plantation owners rewarded new mothers with dresses and silver dollars. But if motherhood provided enslaved women with greater stature and benefits, it was also exhausting. Within days of childbirth, mothers were put back to work, spinning, weaving, and sewing. A few weeks thereafter, they were sent back to the fields. Breastfeeding mothers were often forced to take their babies with them, strapped to their backs. Once women passed their childbearing years, their workload increased. Enslaved girls and women faced the constant threat of sexual abuse. Hundreds of thousands of mulattoes provided physical proof of interracial sexual assault. Female slaves often could improve their circumstances by making horrible choices that offered no guarantee of success. The tragic story of a slave girl named Celia reveals the moral complexity of slavery for African American women and the limited legal options available to them. In 1850, 14-year-old Celia was purchased by Robert Newsom, a Missouri farmer who told his daughters he had bought the girl to be their servant. In fact, however, the recently widowed Newsom wanted a sexual slave. After purchasing Celia, he raped her, and for the next 5 years, he treated her as a mistress, even building her a brick cabin 50 yards from his house. During that time, she gave birth to 2 children. On July 23, 1855, 65-year-old Newsom entered Celia's cabin, ignored her frantic appeals, and kept assaulting her until she struck and killed him with a large stick. She then burned his body in the fireplace. Celia was not allowed to testify at her murder trial because she was a slave. The judge and jury, all white men, pronounced her guilty, and on December 21, 1855, she was hanged. Celia's grim story illustrates the lopsided power structure in Southern society at the time. She bore a double burden, being both a slave and a woman living in a male-dominated society rife with racism and sexism. Despite being victims of terrible injustice and abuse, enslaved African Americans displayed endurance, resilience, and achievement. Wherever they could, they forged their own sense of community, asserted their individuality, and devised ingenious ways to resist. Although states did not recognize slave marriages, they did not prevent men and women from choosing life partners and forging families within the slave system. Many slaveholders considered unofficial marriages a stabilizing influence. A black man who supported a family they assumed would be more reliable and obedient. Sometimes slaveholders performed weddings in the slave quarters or had a minister conduct the service. Whatever the formalities, the norm for the slave community, as for the white, was the nuclear family, with the father as head of the household. Enslaved African Americans often reached out to those who worked with them, with older slave women being addressed as granny or co-workers as sis or brother. Such efforts to create a sense of extended family resembled kinship practices in Africa. One white teacher visiting a slave community observed that they, quote, all belonged to one immense family. The Old South was made up of God-fearing people whose faith sustained them. Although there were pockets of Catholicism and Judaism in the large coastal cities, the vast majority of Southerners, white and black, embraced evangelical Protestant denominations such as Baptists and Methodists, both of which wanted to create a kingdom of God on earth before the millennium, when Jesus would return. This is known in those religions as the Second Coming. In the late 18th century, Baptists had condemned slavery, welcomed blacks to their congregations, and given women important roles in their churches. Some slaveholders, led by George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, had agonized over the immorality of slavery. By the 1830s, however, criticism of slavery in the southern states had virtually disappeared. Most preachers switched from attacking slavery to defending it as divinely ordained, Bible-sanctioned social systems. Among the most important elements of African American culture was its dynamic religion, a mixture of African, Caribbean, and Christian elements. Religion provided slaves with both relief for the soul and release for their emotions. Whites usually tried to eliminate African religion and spirituality from the slave experience. Slaves responded by gathering in secret in what were called camp meetings or bush meetings to worship in their own way and share their pains, joys, and hopes. By 1860, about 20% of adult slaves had joined Christian denominations. Slaves found the Bible inspiring in its support for the poor and the oppressed, and they embraced its promise of salvation through the sacrifice of Jesus. Likewise, the lyrics of religious spirituals helped slaves endure the strain of field labor and express their dreams of gaining freedom in the promised land. Many white planters assumed that Christianized slaves would be more passive and obedient. A South Georgia planter declared that a Christian slave, quote, is more profitable than an unfaithful one. He will do more and better work, be less troublesome, and even less liable to disease. To manage the growing slave trade, markets and auction houses sprang up in every southern city. New Orleans alone had 20 slave trading businesses. Each year, thousands of slaves circulated the city's slave pens. There, they were converted from people into products. They were bathed and groomed, fattened up with bacon, milk, and butter like cattle, assigned categories such as prime number 1, number 2, and second rate, and packaged, aka dressed for sale, in identical blue suits and dresses. On auction day, they were paraded into the sale room. The tallest, strongest, and blackest young men brought the highest prices. As a slaver stressed, quote, I must have, if possible, the jet black Negroes, for they stand the best climate, end quote. Buyers physically inspected each slave on the auction block as if they were horses or cattle. They squeezed their muscles, felt their joints, and pried open their mouths to examine their teeth and gums. They forced the slaves to strip and carefully examined their naked bodies, looking for signs of disease or deformity. They particularly focused on any scars from whipping. As Solomon Northup noted, quote, scars on a slave's back were considered evidence of a rebellious or unruly spirit and hurt his chances for sale. Slave markets in New Orleans also featured the fancy trade, which meant selling women as forced sexual partners. One reporter spied on the auction block, quote, one of the most beautiful women I had ever saw. She was about 16, dressed in a cheap striped woolen gown and bareheaded. Her name was Hermina, and she was sold for $1,250, that is $35,000 today. And this reporter described that she was sold, quote, to one of the most lecherous brutes I ever set eyes on. The same reporter noted that a noble-looking woman and her bright-eyed 7-year-old son were offered for sale as a pair. When no one bid on them, the auctioneer offered them separately. A man from Mississippi bought the boy, while the mother went to a Texan. As her son was dragged away, his mother, quote, burst forth into the most frantic wails that ever despair gave utterance to, end quote. And that is the end of part 3. Part 4, our final part of the video, will talk about the desire for liberty and ways in which slaves were able to resist the slave system.